Islamic History, 625 to 627, Adding Wives and Raising Eyebrows, Part 2. So, this is Part 2 of Adding Wives and Raising Eyebrows. I didn't plan on making this a two-parter, but it just kind of kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger as I planned it, so I decided to break it into two parts, and here's the second part. Now, this is the story of Zayd and Zaynab, and we left off last time with the actual marriage of Muhammad and Zaynab. Now, if you're not following, Zayd is the boy, Zaynab is the girl. So, Muhammad marries Zaynab, who was the wife very recently of his adopted son, Zayd. Now, there will be varying explanations for why this marriage took place, and various theories about what exactly happened and why it happened, and whether it was okay. And it was something Muhammad would have to explain. This wasn't really an optional thing. He really would have to explain this. This was just too different, too much of a break from custom. It was an actual scandal within the Muslim community, and it had to be addressed. And Muhammad had an explanation. And within the Muslim community, the beliefs of the Muslim community, at least within this tight-knit group, it was a very good explanation, or at least an explanation that came from a very, very good source. Now, whether this makes sense, that's in the eyes of the beholder. But as he often did in Medina when things got a little rough, Muhammad turned to his ace in the hole. He could just ask God. So Muhammad asks God, hey, is this all right? And not surprisingly, God okayed the marriage, declaring that the wives of adopted sons don't really count as daughters, so it's not incest, and the marriage went forward. And this revelation was given to the people. It's actually in the Quran, Surah 33, verses 36 to 40. And remember, O Prophet, when you said to the one for whom Allah has done a favor and you too have done a favor, keep your wife and fear Allah, while concealing within yourself what Allah was going to reveal. And so you were considering the people, whereas Allah was more worthy of your consideration. So when Zayd totally lost interest in keeping his wife, we gave her to you in marriage, so that there would be no blame on the believers for marrying the ex-wives of their adopted sons after their divorce. And Allah's command is totally binding. And it goes on. There is no blame on the Prophet for doing what Allah has ordained for him. That has been the way of Allah with those prophets who had gone before, and Allah's command has been firmly decreed. That is his way with those prophets who deliver the messages of Allah and consider him and none but Allah. And sufficient is Allah as a vigilant reckoner. All right, last line here. Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets. And Allah has perfect knowledge of all things. And there we have the famous seal of the prophets passage. Now, this passage is pretty famous, and it means different things to different people, but that's not really our topic right now, so we're not going to get too deeply into it. The important thing is that Muhammad is in the clear. God okayed the marriage, even giving a reason. And the divine reason for this marriage was so that there would be no doubt that adoption does not make the child your relative in any sense of the word, and in every sense of the word. So, kind of like a sweeping Supreme Court decision, this now made it okay for everyone, everywhere, to marry the wives of their adopted sons. And the term adoption kind of got demoted in Arab society. They were no longer exactly the same as blood relatives as they had been before. And I may have said this before, but when you hear this story, the focus is almost always on Muhammad and God and the Quran and all this stuff. But I tend to focus in on Zayd or Zayed, however you pronounce it. I've heard it several ways. So poor Zayd, not only has he lost his wife, although frankly, he may have been better off without her, but he suffered this humiliation. And he even had his last name taken from him in the process. And from now on, adopted sons would be named after their biological parents. Zayd ibn Muhammad would now be known as Zayd ibn Haritha. And that's something that's not just in the histories. It made it into the Quran. Same Surah 33, 4 to 5. Allah does not place two hearts in any person's chest, nor does he regard your wives as unlawful for you like your real mothers, even if you say they are. Nor does he regard your adopted children as your real children. I repeat that. Nor does Allah regard your adopted children as your real children. Let me go on. These are only your baseless assertions, but Allah declares the truth, and he alone guides to the right way. Let your adopted children keep their family names. That is more than just in the sight of Allah. But if you do not know their fathers, then they are simply your fellow believers and close associates. There is no blame on you for what you do by mistake, but only for what you do intentionally. And Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. It's a pretty harsh message, and it's a very difficult message for adopted children if you look at it from their perspective. Just flatly blurting out a blunt and unwanted reality, that thing that is just always lingering in the hearts of adopted children, that thing they suspect may be true, but they really, really don't want it to be true. That lingering thought, these people are not really your parents, and you are not their children. And now you're seeing it definitively said. These people are not your parents, and you are not their children. You don't really have parents. And that really, really has to hurt. And in case you're wondering why I'm focusing on this, full disclosure here, I'm an adopted parent. So you're not getting a fully objective view from me here. It's just impossible. So from my perspective, the idea being conveyed here is just epically, utterly heartbreaking to adopted parents and to adopted children as well. I mean, just the message. Hey, those aren't your real parents. Even though you don't know your biological parents and you never will, you're not really, really part of the family. Can you even imagine the repressed issues Zayed must have carried around for the rest of his life? The loneliness and insecurity and the heartbreak of it all. Zayed is a very sympathetic figure, and I really connect with him. If I were to convert to Islam and take an Arabic name, it would be Zayed. He may merit his own episode someday. And that's the story. And of course, the massive fallout and the theological implications of the entire episode. Now, obviously, there are many different ways to see this. And with something this explosive, I do owe you some varying takes on this controversial situation. Again, one of the few, maybe the only situation, that was controversial even within the Muslim community at the time of Muhammad. So I'll start with the Muslim take. And in the interest of variety, I'll give you three separate takes here that I think cover a pretty good wide range of opinion. So first, the Islamic take. Then I'll do what I call the cynical take. And then third, the sort of middle of the road, historical, non-judgmental, dispassionate take. You have already heard the adoptive parent take. So I won't expand on that anymore. All right. So, take number one, the Islamic take. God gave Zaynab to Muhammad so that the status of adopted sons and daughters and their spouses would be clarified forever. This was a common practice in Arabia, considering adopted children the same as biological children, but it would be no longer. It also gave us the verse on the seal of the prophets, which would prove to be extremely important later in Islamic history. It was also important to elevate Muhammad above his followers, particularly when it comes to number of wives. And this was also a watershed moment in his relationship to the community, to make people understand that Muhammad was fundamentally and almost in kind different than them. After this, they would no longer call him by his first name, and the special exceptions made for Muhammad were for him alone, such as taking more than 4 wives. It was important at this time to create a bit of separation between Muhammad and his followers. And the story about Muhammad seeing Zaynab scantily clad was probably tacked on later from a historical perspective. And the parallels to the biblical story of King David are quite strong. However, there is an important distinction that in this case, Muhammad was more like the better behaved Islamic David than the one from the Bible. But the larger point was to elevate Muhammad and to clear up a few things regarding adoption. That was the Islamic take. So now here's the second take, the cynical take, maybe extremely cynical, depending on your perspective. Now, the cynical take here would be Muhammad wanted Zaynab so much, he was willing to endure the scandal and humiliate his only son. It would not be the first time that a powerful man did this in history. It's actually exceptionally common that, you have a guy who loves this woman. Let's even say Henry VIII, that he does otherwise irrational things to acquire her. This idea is that Muhammad became so used to being in charge that he was able to rationalize anything he wanted, anything that benefited him. He had come a long way from the humble man receiving revelations from God. He was now, consciously or unconsciously, a person willing to just make up whatever was most convenient or most beneficial to him. It may just be a raw power play. He was now a man above the usual rules, and he could change them based on whatever appetite or desire he may have. Or he may have been sincere but motivated, or gave in to temptation, as in, just think of the things the devil can whisper in your ear when it's convenient. It's one of history's greatest examples of the corrupting nature of power. In the cynical mind, this is the moment where the revelations are less focused on truth and spirituality and a bit more geared toward advancing the prospects of Muhammad himself. You saw this beginning in some verses after the Battle of Uhud, and now there's this. And this is just a whole other level of cynical, self-serving revelation. This is the watershed moment where Muhammad and the Quran seem far less sympathetic through non-Muslim eyes, where the non-believing cynic starts to see some familiar patterns and similarities to less sympathetic figures like Joseph Smith of the Mormon religion and other religious leaders who seem to just follow that time-tested tradition of new religious movements. The leader always ends up with the women. For some reason, it's almost an iron law. The religious leader always has his choice of women, and he gets more women than anybody else. So, for the cynics, in this cynical take, this is the turning point where Muhammad begins to look less like a holy man and more like a normal man. This won't be the only example, and a man willing to use religion for power and or personal gain. This is the moment when the idea of the revelation seemed less and less believable, that someone who once seemed a plausible prophet begins to look like something else entirely. So that's the cynical take. I did promise you a third take, sort of a third way, an interpretation kind of between those two things. Let's call it the historian's take, a dispassionate observation about this event in its time and place. And this take, it's really more of an agnostic type of opinion. It's one that's most likely to be held by someone with no religious or moral judgments to make. And in defense of this view, I should also point out that in the world Muhammad inherited, there was no such thing as universal moral standards. That's something Islam was creating, not something that existed before. So, really, unless you take previous moral systems, like the Judeo Christian world that we live in, or that the Jews of Medina lived in, there really was no existing rule regarding this type of thing. There was nothing to really judge it against, only customs and traditions. And in this awkward situation, more than anything, that's what Muhammad had broken, a custom and a tradition regarding adopted children. It certainly wasn't the only norm he was changing, polytheism being the largest one. So a person who is advocating more of this third way would say, it's just really unfair to judge Muhammad based on a system of universal behavior that didn't really exist at the time. Does that make sense? From this view, it's kind of like wandering into the jungles of Papua New Guinea and judging the quality of their baseball skills. It's ridiculous because they don't know what baseball is. Now, yes, they're probably pretty bad at it, but they have a very good reason for being bad at it. And it is a very interesting perspective, I think. And it's an attitude that's very common among those who have, let's say, a greater than average interest in history, especially because you don't know every detail. You just don't. Most serious historians are hands off when it comes to judgments and moral condemnations, especially when you're going way, way back in history. Now, this approach is particularly useful when looking at someone like, not Alexander, let's go Julius Caesar. Caesar, was he a good guy or a bad guy? Now, if you asked me, my answer would probably be neither. I understand what the Roman establishment thought, and I also understand sort of the elite hypocrisies Caesar threatened, and there's the difficult choice he faced at the Rubicon. These things are not easy, they're not always cut and dry. And that same approach can be used for similar figures in history. It's pretty standard stuff for any well known historical figure or movement, when looking back at them. However, it does become a bit more complex when you're talking about a religious figure, someone claiming to have something from God. And in Muhammad's case, someone who is held up as a model of behavior for all of mankind, forever. That's what invites the moral scrutiny thrown at Muhammad in episodes like this. Not that he was some kind of evil figure, but that, given the claims about him, he has an almost impossibly high bar to clear. If there were a similar episode regarding Genghis Khan, no one would bat an eyebrow. Khan was a vicious murderer who ended up fathering so many children that even now, one in every 200 men is a direct descendant of his. But does he receive criticism? No, he does not. Does he deserve it? Well, yes, absolutely. But Khan was a different type of figure. He wasn't creating moral standards. He was conquering people. And by that measure, he was great. He's not on anyone's moral radar, so it doesn't even come up. But Muhammad is different. He is a different type of figure. The focal point of Muhammad's career, the only reason he is famous, it's not just as a lawgiver and as a lawmaker, but as the creator of a moral world, of the religion of Islam, and the billion or so people on this earth who practice that religion. Now, that religion emphasizes correct action, and Muhammad is supposed to be the model of correct action. And this is a judgment made in the moral realm, not in the historical realm or the political realm. This is a moral judgment, and one that will be made in the Judeo-Christian tradition that Muhammad was claiming to represent. Now, that's the world I live in, and I think, all things considered, a pretty fair world in which to judge Muhammad's actions. Now, I suppose if you wanted to, you could judge this in some other religious moral world, let's say Hinduism. But Muhammad never said anything about Krishna and Vishnu. He said plenty about Moses and Jesus. So, in the Judeo-Christian world, was this a correct action by Muhammad? Probably not. At least not from what I can see from my seat 1400 years in the future. And does it make Muhammad a bad person? Well, not necessarily. It just makes him a person. Even good people make mistakes. Lots of them. The Bible is full of them. Moses, David, Peter, great men who made some pretty massive mistakes. Now, then again, you could also say those people came to understand their error. And if Muhammad is guilty of an error in this case, he certainly never acknowledged it. It's not like he couldn't admit error and survive. I mean, it's been done. Surah 80 of the Quran is specifically about an error Muhammad made and sought to correct. But once you actually have God weighing in the matter, you can't really admit, there's just no going back at that point. So, from a Judeo Christian perspective, was this right? I don't think so. But I also don't think it's a uniquely horrible thing either. It's certainly not as severe an error as what the biblical David did, for example, and I certainly don't view David, despite his mistakes, as an inherently bad person. Now, would it be fair to condemn Muhammad morally here? Especially if you take religion out of the equation? Is it really fair to hold Muhammad to the standard of perfection? Well, again, that depends on your opinion of Muhammad. Personally, I don't hold him to a super high standard because of my beliefs about him. That's a non Muslim opinion. Now, I'm not holding Muhammad to a wildly high standard because I don't believe he is the perfect model of human behavior. Muslims do, at least many Muslims do. So this is, quite simply, easier for someone like me. I don't need to explain this episode or bat away more cynical takes on what Muhammad was really up to. The Muslim defense here, boiled down to its simplest form, is it was right because God said it was right. The Quran said this was okay, and it's from God, therefore it is a righteous action. And again, whether that holds any water depends entirely on your view of the Quran and, of course, your view of Muhammad. And that's pretty much all I've got on this fascinating historical event, whatever you may think of it. You could say it was a godly thing. You could say it was a selfish move followed by a fabricated revelation. You could even say, I don't know, and I have no opinion on it. These are all very valid, defensible views. But historically, we do know this for sure. Zaynab and Zayd divorced. Muhammad married Zaynab, and the Quran would record that this was all good and above board. It was a bit of a scandal at the time, but the community obviously got over it. And while this could be seen as a rather minor story, it happened at a pivotal time in Muhammad's life, historically, that is. This is the time where you start to see some historical forks in the road as far as people's opinions of Muhammad are concerned. This is when, in the minds of non believers, Muhammad veers off the holy road and turns toward a focus on self enrichment, a focus on politics over morals, and a turn in the Quran, too, from believable revelations to more arguably self serving ones. But again, that's all in the eyes of the beholder. If you're a Muslim, there were no such changes. But historically, for Muslims and non Muslims alike, this event represents a major change in Muhammad's relationship to his community. Believer, non believer, it's obvious at this time that Muhammad becomes more set apart from the wider Muslim community, more above the community, you could say. And the intimate community of the early days starts to be lost. He's no longer just a man with the people. He now has a different set of rules than the rest of the community. He's no longer even called Muhammad. He is just the prophet. Now, the seal of the prophets, the Quran tells us here, that title can be traced back to this specific episode, this fascinating, strangely consequential little story in Islamic history. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.